That's what we're going to do with the attributes of God to build up the representational structure a little bit. So the hypothesis is that God is an abstracted ideal, formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or ruler. And the underlying idea there too is that when the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt. And the biblical Egypt is a tyranny. And so there's a very, very solid idea in the Old Testament that I think took people, God only knows how long to figure out, that if you confused the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone. And that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now. When the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt, and the biblical Egypt is the archetypal tyranny. So, what is God like? Well, from the Christian perspective, there's three elements. One seems to have something to do with tradition. And so that's God the Father, and that's partly the embodiment, I would say, of the human being, and that's an ancient thing. And it's also partly the embodiment of the tradition of human beings, which is also a very ancient thing. And that's the structure, as I said. It's the structure that consciousness emerges from that enables us to grapple with the unknown as such. And then there's the intermediary between that and Christ, say, that's the Holy Spirit, that's that bird. And that's the Spirit in a more abstracted sense. And I would say that's probably as close as Christianity ever got to the notion of consciousness as such. Disembodied consciousness, something like that. And then there's the notion of the suffering individual, and that's a very complicated idea. And it's something like, so there's this idea, an old idea, and I believe this was originally a Jewish idea, that something with the attributes of God, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, lacks something. So it's like a Zen cone. It's a really interesting idea, because you think, well, what in the world can something like that lack? And the idea is limitation. So something that's everything lacks limitation. And that idea, like when I first encountered that, just blew me away. I thought it was such a brilliant realization that there are advantages to not being able to do things. Partly because it gives you something to do. I suppose that's a big part of it, right? Is if you had everything you wanted at every moment at your fingertips, well, there's nothing, there's no story. And it's funny, because that happened to Superman, the cartoon character. By the 1980s, he could juggle planets, and you could bounce like hydrogen bombs off him and be fine. It's like everyone got bored because, well, what were we going to do to Superman? It's like you lob a hydrogen bomb at him and he just brushes it off and like combs his hair, and that's the end of that. And the whole cartoon series basically died because he didn't have any flaws. There's no story without the limitation. And I think that's an absolutely remarkable idea. And so part of the notion of Christ, and this is something that I've puzzled over for a long time, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, is that there's an idea in Christianity that there's consciousness as such, which in some sense is eternal. It stretches from the beginning of the time to the end of time, but it's this abstracted notion. But it lacks a certain kind of reality because it's not instantiated somewhere. It's not instantiated in a specific time and place in history. And so the idea of the Son, the third part of the Trinity, or one of the three parts of the Trinity, is the notion that tradition and consciousness as such also has to be embedded in history in a particular time and place. And so there's the archetypal embeddedness, and that would be the incarnation, and that's the perfect man, right, who accepts his mortality and acts in a virtuous manner. But it's the archetypal story of every individual as well. And there's a very strong strain in Christianity. I would say this is more pronounced in Orthodox Christianity, that the proper path of life is to take the tradition, let's say, and the spirit that's associated with consciousness as such, and to act it out in your life, in your own personal life, in a manner that's analogous to the manner in which Christ acted it out in his life. And what that means in part is the acceptance of the tragic preconditions of existence. And so that's partly betrayal, right? Betrayal by friends and by family and by the state. And it's partly punishment for sins that you did not commit, as well as the ones you did commit, and sometimes that's just a relief, but the arbitrary nature of justice, and also the fact of finitude. And the notion is that your duty, let's say, and the way to set things right in the cosmos is to accept that as a necessary precondition for being and to act virtuously despite that. And that's a very, very powerful idea as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also, the world's a weird place, and I've seen some very strange things in my life. And one of the things that I've seen is that, I've dealt with some people who were very, let's say, that they weren't on a good path. Let's put it that way. And one of the things that was really interesting about being around people like that, it was almost like they were surrounded by a gravitational field of sorts. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously. And their worldview was so warped and twisted that if you came within contact of them, you all of a sudden started to play a part in their drama. And it was almost inevitable. They would maneuver and manipulate and interpret in a way that made you into the villain in their story, no matter what it was that you wanted to do. And unless you've encountered something like that, and many of you probably have, you don't know how powerful a pull that is. And so it's certainly possible that someone can act in a like a gravitational object and bend things around them to fit their narrative, their unhappy and tragic narrative. But I've seen the opposite too, where people who were aiming upward with the best of their ability, and because of that, they had a positive effect on the people around them, and that ordered things around them in profound ways. And I think it's an open question, the degree to which the cosmos would order itself around you properly if you got yourself together as much as you could get yourself together. We know that things can go very, very badly wrong if you do things very badly wrong. There's no doubt about that. But the converse is also true. If you start to sort yourself out properly and then you have a beneficial effect on your family, first of all, that's going to echo down the generations, but it also spreads out into the community. And we are networked together. We're not associated linearly. We all affect each other. And so it's an open question, the degree to which acting out the notion the notion that being is good, and the notion that you can accept its limitations and that you should still strive for virtue. It's an open question how profound effect that would have on the structure of reality if you really chose to act it out. And I've seen things, as I said, in my life that indicate that I do believe there's a metaphysical element to life as well as the rational, practical element. And I think there are times when those two things come together, and I've seen that happen. And so I don't think we know the limits of virtue. I don't think we know what true virtue could bring about if we aimed at it carefully and practically. And so the notion that there's something divine about the individual who accepts the conditions of existence and still strives for the good, I think that that's an idea that's very much worth paying attention to. And I think the fact that people have considered that idea for at least 2,000 years quite seriously is also an indication that there's at least something to be thought about in relationship to that. So that's kind of the Trinitarian idea. Same idea there. And you see, it's interesting too, because you have God the Father, essentially, who's coming out of this strange, you see, this isn't the sky exactly, and you see this very often in these old pictures. It's not exactly the sky, whatever the heaven was that people believed in. It's something it's like the sky opens and there's a dimension beyond the sky. It's something like that. And I wanted to show you this too, just to show you that this isn't only a Western conception. And it has something to do with mystical experience, because there's a bodhisattva. It kind of looks like he has a hat, but that's not a hat. That's a whole bunch of bodhisattvas going back to eternity, right? And this hole in the sky here is like a hole into time, and these things are recurring across time. It's the eternal recurrence of this redemptive archetype, and the sky opens up, and you can see that thing recurring and recurring and recurring. Same idea is basically, that's the blue Buddha, who's a healing entity, sitting in a mandala, which is like a representation of paradise. And it's the same idea. It's like reality opens up and reveals this image of perfection. And so it's Well, it's a universal conception, and well, I think it's a representation of the possibility of the metaphysical and the physical coming together in some sort of communication. It's something like that, anyways. And I mean, you have to remember that there's absolutely no doubt that people have metaphysical and religious experiences. That's an absolute fact. You can induce them chemically. You can induce them electrochemically. Lots of people who have epilepsy have epileptic prodromas that are associated with divine enlightenment. So Dostoevsky, for example, he had epilepsy, and that was really, I think, one of the things that made him a great author. And Dostoevsky would have this feeling that he was going to have an epileptic seizure, and he said that the feeling for him was that the world was opening up and he was becoming more and more and more enlightened, and he was just on the verge of grasping the essence of existence, and then he'd have an epileptic seizure. And for the subjective feeling was that much knowledge was just too much for him to bear. Well, you can say, well, that was a neurological abnormality, and fine, but God, he was Dostoevsky, and so you can't just brush that off. So, yeah, well, so that's the Trinitarian idea fundamentally, and this notion here is the notion that, well, the cross is a funny thing, because the cross marks the center, and it's an X, and the X is the center of the world, like the X that a cathedral is, and it's the center of the world is where you are, because as a consciousness, you're the center of the world, and that center of the world is a place of betrayal and suffering and limitation. That's exactly what it is. And the question is, well, given that, and given the fact that you know it, what the hell are you supposed to do about it? And what that representation, I believe that's Goya, what that representation implies is that you're supposed to voluntarily accept that and then move forward well, in good faith and with courage. That's the notion. And that you're supported. You're supported by your tradition, and that's why you need your tradition too. That's why you need to be embedded in your tradition, because without that, without the support, let's say, of your father, and I mean that both practically and metaphysically, without that behind you, without the knowledge of you as both a biological and a cultural creature, without that depth of knowledge, you don't have the courage to do it, because you don't know what you are, what you could be. And so without that, because you're a historical creature, what? Students ask me sometimes, why study history? It's like, well, because history is about you. That's why. It's like history tells you who you are. You can't tell who you are because you only live a little while. How the hell can you figure out who you are? So you need all this collected wisdom and all this dream-like information and all this mythology and all this narrative to inform you about what you are beyond what you see of yourself. And you're pummeled down and people picked on you and there's 50 things about you that are horrible, and you've got a self-esteem problem and you're sort of hunched over and you've got all these problems, and so it's not easy to see, let's say, the divinity that lurks behind that, unless you're aware of the heroic stories of the past and the metaphysics of consciousness, let's say. I don't think that you can have the courage to regard yourself as the sort of creature that can stand up underneath that intense existential burden and move forward in courage and grace. And of course, that's part of the reason that I'm talking about these biblical stories, and it's 9:30, so we're going to have to stop.